Engineers from China, Russia, and even the United States were left in awe. What they witnessed was the legendary fuel pipeline running along the Truong Son mountain range, a route that no American general could have anticipated. They were forced to admit, Vietnam's fuel pipeline was a real-life legend. From 1968 to 1974, Vietnamese troops constructed a total of 5,000 kilometers of pipeline, the longest in the world at that time. It wasn't until 10 years later that China managed to build a pipeline of similar length. Thanks to this system, newly supplied vehicles had the gasoline needed to transport goods to the battlefield. Tanks and airplanes were fueled and ready to fight for the liberation of the South and national unification. Recognizing its critical role, leaders of the General Department of Logistics even declared that they would be willing to grind gold into dust, if that's what it took to build this pipeline. Why is this fuel line called a legend? Because its construction was incredibly meticulous and creative. Everyone knows the U.S. is the godfather of the oil industry, the same country that abandoned the gold standard to establish the oil-backed dollar. More than anyone, they understood the vital importance of fuel to any nation. Their big question was, how could Vietnamese vehicles keep moving? Where did the planes get their fuel? How could tanks have enough to fight? In 1968, all vehicles carrying gasoline to the southern battlefield were relentlessly bombed. This forced Vietnamese troops to invent all sorts of methods to get fuel into the South. How could fuel be transported without being detected by the enemy? One early method was filling plastic bags with fuel, putting them in backpacks, and carrying them on foot to the battlefield. But this method proved ineffective. 200 people could barely carry 2 fuel drums worth. Many soldiers suffered from fuel poisoning, lead exposure, and some even died during transportation. When that failed, we switched to 20-liter cans or rolling fuel barrels across streams. But this method also fell short. It took 2 weeks to transport enough fuel that would be consumed by trucks in just 2 days. Ultimately, we decided to gather all available pipe materials, water pipes, iron rods, even bamboo, to construct a makeshift pipeline. This method initially showed promise. However, bamboo couldn't withstand the pressure. After some use, the fuel leaked out. Testing worked for about 100 meters, but extending it to thousands of kilometers was impossible. Fortunately, during a working trip to the Soviet Union, General Vo Nguyen Giap observed their oil transportation system and brought the idea back to Vietnam. We thought the problem was solved, but no. Vietnam and the Soviet Union faced completely different conditions. First, the Soviets had excellent air defense systems. We didn't. If American bombs were dropped, how would we protect the pipes? Second, the Soviets only used their pipelines for short-term campaigns. We needed something that would last the entire war. Third, our mountainous terrain was incredibly complex. During a high-level meeting, generals fell silent, trying to solve the problem. That's when Lieutenant General Dinh Duc Thien stepped up and promised General Giap that he would find a way. But secrecy was paramount. If the enemy found out, the pipeline couldn't be built. We had to conduct strict counterintelligence operations to keep the construction hidden. But somehow, despite our precautions, the enemy kept bombing our pipeline locations, sometimes even before we had laid anything down. Now, the challenge was to outsmart the Americans' precise calculations. Pipelines crossing rivers had to be sunken to the bottom so the current wouldn't sweep them away, bombs wouldn't destroy them, and the enemy couldn't see them. On land, trenches were plowed deep by buffalo, with the pipe buried underneath. Crops were planted above as usual. That worked on flat land, but what about mountains and hills? Laying pipes the standard way would get them bombed to rubble. The only solution was to install them over mountain passes up to 1,000 meters high. But how would the fuel make it up there? Pumps had to overcome up to 400 atmospheres of pressure. One wrong move and the pipe would burst. So the Army devised a system of multi-stage pumping, gradually moving the fuel uphill. Bit by bit, the fuel made it over the pass, and the pipe held strong. This became a Guinness-level record at the time. No other country, not even Germany, dared to imagine such a thing, let alone build it. Fortunately, no record was officially recognized. Otherwise, it would have blown our cover. Fuel kept flowing to the front lines. The soldiers could now fight with peace of mind. But in 1972, the U.S. resumed bombing Hanoi and Haiphong, cutting off our Soviet fuel supply routes to Haiphong port. This forced us to extend the pipeline to Lac Son, where we received Soviet fuel via China's Fangcheng port. That's why Vietnam's wartime fuel pipeline reached a staggering 5,000 kilometers in length, the world's longest at that time. It earned the admiration of all, and even the Americans had to concede. Vietnam's fuel pipeline was a living legend.